there were approximately 90 some odd different species that the government was interacting with, and that has grown. Now, 2022, actually in the last, let's say 20 years, that's been reduced to just maybe 5 or 6 different groups that they interact with. The others have been, let's say, expelled by the reptilians because they don't want them interfering here.
So with the reptilians in particular, what was it about the Montauk Project that they were interested in? Were they, I know you mentioned 300,000 children and adults. Were they interested in the genetics and how genetics could be used for these kind of time travel portal experiments? Or what else was it that the reptilians in particular were interested in?
The reptilian race, and by the way, there's more than one type of reptilian race. These were from the Draco Empire. They have an agenda to fan out through creation and assimilate and to occupy all. For them, that is their, lack of a better term, holy mission of their existence. They believe they are the superior race and that all others are inferior, and they need to either control them or change them. The reptilians, this particular race, are androgynous, meaning male and female in the same body. And that's why, Michael, we are seeing an agenda to create androgynous people on this planet, where boys are told they're girls and girls are told they're boys, and you want to be a giraffe, you could be a giraffe. I mean, you could just, there's no identity anymore. When you remove the identity of a person, then you can control them because they don't know who they are. So you tell them who they are and you tell them what they can do. And that's what unfortunately is happening on our planet.
You're listening to Exopolitics Today with Dr. Michael Salla, your source for the uncensored truth regarding the human, extraterrestrial, global, and political agenda. Click the like button and subscribe to this channel. And now, here's Dr. Michael Salla.
It's my great delight to welcome Stewart Swerdlow to Exopolitics Today. Stewart has been involved in some very important projects that have been run clandestinely by the secret government. And one of those was the Montauk Project that ran from the 1970s into the early 80s. And so he knows a lot about it. He was directly involved. So welcome, Stewart, to the show.
Thank you, Michael. It's my pleasure to be here.
Well, there's a lot of people in my audience that really don't know anything about Montauk. So maybe you can just explain what is the Montauk Project and how did you get involved?
Okay. Montauk Project was an outgrowth of the Cold War and actually World War II. As people may know, during World War II, the Nazis were the enemy. After World War II, the Russians became the enemy. And then, of course, there was the UFOs that would appear in the sky, which is an entirely other topic. But the US also used it to promote some kind of fear in the public so that they could get money for military and so on. It's a very old story that actually goes back many centuries of the few elite or royal people, and I use that term loosely, who need to control large amounts of people. And the Germans especially realized that when you're just a few million, technically, against billions, armies and weapons are not enough. So the best way to control people is through programming and mind control. And so that is how the Montauk Project began. They chose the Montauk Point area of eastern Long Island, New York, which if you look at a map, you can see New York City, and then this fish-shaped island towards the east with the fins sticking out towards the Atlantic Ocean. And on the southern point, that's Montauk Point, which was inhabited by the Montauk Indians. And interestingly enough, the Montauk Indians are the only tribes in North America that call their leader Pharaoh. And there's evidence that they perhaps were descendants of the ancient Egyptians who actually traveled much further than people realize. And so Montauk area was developed actually back in 1799 by George Washington when he was concerned of a British invasion of North America. And so at the very eastern point of Long Island, he created a storehouse for weapons, a base, and a lighthouse. And over the decades, that was expanded and expanded, especially through the 1800s. And unfortunately, the American government appropriated the land from the Montauk Indians, sent them away, and actually, after the Civil War, forced some of the native or the slaves that had been released to go to this area, intermarry with the Montauk Indians, and so that they would be a mixed race. The point being that under US law, if there is a native tribe where there are less than 100 pure members, they're no longer considered a tribe and they forfeit their land and rights. And that's exactly what happened to the Montauk Indians. And so the government appropriated this area, especially in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and they started expanding the underground area of the Montauk Lighthouse until it was quite a few layers deep. What happened was, as they dug under the area, they actually found evidence of a superior civilization. And on the beach to the south and west of Montauk Point, in those days, there was the tops of what looked like pyramids sticking out of the sand. And the government said that these were built by the natives centuries ago, but of course they were not. And during the hurricane of 1938, the ocean and the storms actually buried the remains of those pyramids so that they're no longer visible on the surface. But the government had kept digging and digging underneath and actually created an underground submarine base. And they found that there was a huge technological pyramid under this area with equipment, devices, etc., which we know came from the time of Atlantis. Montauk area is actually the top of a mountain. And it is the remains of an archipelago that extended from this area down to what is now the Caribbean, where the Atlantean continent used to exist. I'm just giving you a very detailed background of what happened. And so they found this technology. They started developing this base, especially after World War II. And in fact, in World War II, the local population of Montauk would see German U-boats coming in towards the coastline, sinking below the ocean, and then days later, they would see them leaving. Nobody stopped them. So at some level of government, the United States and the Germans were actually working together. And that's something difficult for people to accept, but quite frankly, it's true even today. And so after the 50s and the 60s, when the Cold War was becoming very intense and the so-called Soviet threat was becoming intense, they built Air Force bases in strategic points along the east and west coast. One of them was in the Montauk base area, and it's called Camp Hero. And there they installed SAGE radar, which was supposed to identify Soviet aircraft coming towards the American coastline. However, during the mid to late 60s, SAGE radar became obsolete. And many of these bases were actually either changed or converted to something else or closed. Montauk base became almost like a derelict base. And then the government in late 1960s took it over for experimental purposes covertly. And they extended the space to 9 levels underneath the ground. And they decided that they were going to take the German scientists that were brought here under Project Paperclip after the war, who were very proficient in the development of mind control and programming for human beings. And they brought them to this location, added the alien technology that had been accumulated over the previous decades, and the Montauk Project began. Now, that was about 1970 is when it actually officially began. The whole project ran from 1970 to 1983. And in the beginning, they used for experimental purposes people who they considered to be expendable, people that no one would miss. So for example, they would use children of alcoholics, foster children, orphans that nobody had adopted. They would even drive into New York City and pick up homeless people on the street and bring them for experimental purposes. And if you may recall, back in, I guess it was the 80s and 90s, they had these milk containers with missing people on them. And many of those people, unfortunately, especially the children, were used in this Montauk Project. Initially, they did experimentation involving programming, picking up where the Germans left off, so to speak. They also did electromagnetic experiments, weather manipulation, advanced weaponry testing and development, and eventually they actually got into time travel and interdimensional travel. And this was over the series of, let's say, the first 7 to 8 years of the project. And here again, they used expendable people. They would send them through the portals to see where they would end up. Mind you, peripheral to all of this, the US government and other governments were in contact with alien civilizations for a very long time and got equipment and technology. One of the things that they received were coordinates into deep space and also into alternate realities so that you could travel from point A to point B instantaneously. And that's a whole nother technological aspect. And they found out that the coordinates that were given to them by certain alien groups were incorrect. They were not the proper coordinates. So then they began the process of developing their own series of development points. So they would send a person to a specific frequency and see if the person came back. And then eventually they would have what we called an anchor, which was a device that connected to the frequencies of the Montauk base, so that the person who would go there would leave this anchor and then return, and then they would have a direct path to these locations in time and space without having to develop it over again.
Well, there's a lot there to kind of like just look at and unpack. You know, one of the things you mentioned was this SAGE radar program that was used during the Cold War to track aircraft. But in my kind of like cursory reading of the Montauk Project, that was repurposed for both mind control and for time travel use. So can you explain about that SAGE radar dish and how that was repurposed for the Montauk program?
Yes, and again, I'm not a technical person, so I can't give you the details about it, but correctly, the antenna, which looked kind of like a curved metallic net, if you will, that was on top of this very tall concrete building, it would be used to transmit frequencies into the atmosphere, or actually into the Earth itself. Initially, they did this to alter weather patterns. So you would notice during the 60s, actually 70s and 80s, there were many hurricanes that were diverted along the east coast of the United States and went directly towards Montauk Point because they were testing how to drive a storm, so to speak, or manipulate, expand it, and so on. And other things that they did was to bounce frequencies off of the ionosphere so that they would then be directed to a specific target elsewhere on the planet for purposes of mind control, weather manipulation, and so on. And this was a precursor to the network that they put in Alaska and even northern Norway, which was to create a web of like a matrix around the ionosphere of the planet, so that they could pinpoint certain locations for whatever they were targeting. And anyway, I don't know if I answered the question.
Yeah,
or not.
Yeah, that's good. I just wanted to know also, like you said that people running the Montauk Project were given coordinates by aliens in space, and
Yes.
they sent these expendables through those, whatever it was, a portal or a device. So can you describe anything? Can you describe what kind of a device it was, what kind of portal it was that people were being sent through to these coordinates, and what would happen to them, and did some people come back? And yeah.
Initially, they received technology from the beings from the star system of Sirius A. The beings from Sirius A, from the perspective of our government, had the highest technology that they could find. And the Syrians would exchange that. They were kind of like intergalactic merchants, for lack of a better word. They didn't care about who was the good side, the bad side, or what have you. They just cared about what they were going to get out of it, as far as their ability to receive merchandise and trade and so on. And we found out, for example, that they gave us the wrong or incorrect information. So when we sent someone, let's say as an example, they said we'd go to the underground of Mars, when in fact that person would wind up inside a rock or in deep space or under the ocean and would die. And we learned a lesson in the Philadelphia experiment, which was in 1943. And you may have heard that story because there's a connection between the Philadelphia experiment and the Montauk Project. Back in 1943, the government was using Tesla electromagnetic devices to create invisibility cloaks for their ships and aircraft. And there was one ship called the USS Liberty, which was docked in the Philadelphia Naval Yard. And they had put the equipment on there to test it. And when they turned the equipment on, the ship leaped out of physical reality, went into what we call hyperspace. Human beings and physical objects are not designed to go into hyperspace. So it created a very big issue. The sailors on board would walk through what were walls that were now just energy. And then when the ship became solid again, many of those people were embedded in floors, walls, ceilings, and so on. However, there were 3 people who had jumped overboard and wound up at the Montauk Project in 1983, 40 years in the future from them. It created a time loop because the Montauk Project and the Philadelphia experiment were emitting huge electromagnetic pulses at the same time in time and space. And so they linked together into a loop. And that loop still exists. It's considered to be a roadway or a vortex between 2 points in time and space. And at this point, I need to clarify the difference between what science calls a wormhole and a vortex. They're actually 2 different things, although they're similar. A wormhole creates a shortcut between point A and point B within the same reality. A vortex creates a shortcut between point A and B between different realities. So that is the difference. So when we discuss wormholes and vortices, that must keep in mind. And people interchange them, and it's not correct.
So just in better understanding what happened between the Philadelphia experiment and the Montauk Project. Now, I think it was the USS Eldridge, right, where that was involved in that, and the three sailors that somehow jumped off the ship and ended up at Montauk. Were they Al Bielek and Duncan Cameron? Were they two?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And there was more than one ship. The Eldridge is the most famous of them. And that was, let's say, the worst result, causing the most death. And by the way, many, many years later, I was doing work in Oregon, and a gentleman came to see me who was not on the schedule, and he claimed to be a courier at that time for the US government. And he told me that some of the sailors who actually did survive became mentally incapacitated and were sent to a facility high up in the mountains of Central Oregon, and their families were told that they had been killed in the war. And so then there was no body to present to them, but they had been studied for decades after to see the results of these experiments. I assume by now they're not around anymore, but I don't know. Over the years, I have gotten many confirmations. In fact, I'm working currently with a physicist from France who actually works or did work at NASA, very high up level at NASA. And he told me that he actually worked in the Montauk Project, and that confirmed all of this. And people I have been meeting in military and government over the years have also confirmed this to me. And I suspect that in the not too distant future, this will then become part of a historical record, so to speak, allowed for the public. And I had mentioned to you a long time before that over the years, especially after the first books came out in the 90s, we were not allowed to talk about Montauk Project. So on the media, especially, I would never be able to do an interview on that because, first of all, it was not allowed. And second of all, you were considered to be a mentally deranged person for discussing such a thing that never existed. And so, of course, now with the way things have developed, we can see that everything they told us in the Montauk Project that would happen is now happening. And I put this in my first book called Montauk Alien Connection, which was written in the late 90s. And in that book, I had a list of all of the events they told us would happen in the future. And sadly, they're all happening. And so this plan, what we see going on now in the world, is not something that's a surprise for anyone. This has been planned for quite a long time.
So with these people that jumped off the Eldridge, Al Bielek and Duncan Cameron, so they jumped off in 1983 into...
1943.
Okay, so 1943 was the experiment. And
of Philadelphia, yeah.
Of Philadelphia, and then they kind of jumped off the ship and they ended up in Montauk in 1983. Is that correct? So
1983.
1983. So, okay, so 1983. So they end up in Montauk, and which is also the end of, supposedly the end of the Montauk Project. And so, how did that play out? I mean, how were these people being dropped off there? In 1983, how was that part of the Montauk Project coming to an end?
Two different stories, because when Al and Duncan arrived in 1983, they were interrogated and they were sent back to 1943. Because Duncan then, in 1970, became the lead psychic on the so-called Montauk chair that you may have heard about, which was also technology from Sirius A, which was able to pick up your thought patterns, amplify them, and then manifest them physically. So from 1970 to 1983, there were approximately 300,000 people, children and adults, that were used in various types of experiments. Most of them did not survive. By the early 1980s, the security, the oversight became a bit lax, so that the strict rules and regulations involving the equipment and operations were not as enforced as they had been in previous years. And so I believe you're asking how it came to an end. And so Duncan was part of an experiment. That this experiment ended and he just fell asleep on the chair. But the equipment wasn't turned off. They were just not paying attention, supposedly. Or who knows, maybe this was a sabotage, I don't know. But he had a nightmare, Duncan, and the equipment on the chair picked it up, the energy of his nightmare, connected it to an alternate reality where an energetic, for lack of a better term, creature or being existed, created a vortex to that location, and this creature came through into the Montauk Project. It was not a physical creature that you could touch and so on. It was more like an energy being. You could see its outline, you could see the glow of its energy, but you couldn't hold it, for example. And if you shot at it, bullets passed through. And so this creature started to wreak havoc, started to destroy the base. They turned off the equipment, and it still existed. It was drawing its energy source from its own dimension without the equipment. And so what they had to do was create an energy field that was kind of like an antimatter pulse as they destroyed the equipment, and the creature suddenly froze. It just froze in place. And that's where it remained. We couldn't get rid of it, and the project was destroyed, the equipment was destroyed, and it took, actually, I would say almost 10 years, 12 years, for the energy field of this creature to dissipate so that it could no longer be seen. And the base, of course, was closed off to the public the entire time. Subsequently, they started destroying the surface buildings. And interestingly now, if you go there, the radar tower is enclosed by a fence so that you can't get into it. And all of the surface buildings are now completely removed. And they have made a park out of this Camp Hero. And there's signs on the base that says you're not allowed to dig in the base because of possible live ordnance. And so I would ask, how could they open a base as a park knowing that there's explosive devices possibly buried underground? So obviously that's not true. They just don't want you digging to find entrances and so on. They have cemented over all of the entrances. You can't get any more. And so that's where we are now with the Montauk base. However, the experiments have continued elsewhere. There were places in the Western United States and in parts of Europe where they have continued in a different way. For example, in Geneva, the Hadron Collider is part of the extension of the Montauk Project. It's an interdimensional device.
That makes sense. So with this Montauk chair, it was an alien device given to those running the Montauk Project. So we talk, even though it was an Air Force station, I believe the Montauk Project was run by the US Navy, if I recall correctly. So can you describe the Montauk chair? What did it look like? I mean, was it an actual chair that could be used for a piloting a spacecraft that was repurposed for this Montauk project? I mean, how did it look?
If you can imagine a very large dental chair, you know how you sit in a dental chair and you recline and it has these arms, but this chair had these head, I don't even know how to describe it. It went around your head, and it didn't touch your head, but it went around it, and it would pick up, it had sensors that would pick up your brainwaves. And it took the brainwaves and went to what Preston described as a super cray computer, and that could store the information, amplify the information, transmit it, and so on. Now, what you're describing for vehicles that actually, what you would call a UFO, there are many, many different kinds, by the way. Most of them are connected to the mind of the operator, or what you'd call the pilot, so that there really are not so much controls on board. All the pilot has to do is think of where they want to go or do in the vehicle, which is a semi-living creature / technology response. And it's all done electromagnetically. And they learned how to go to any point in time and space and trillions of light years away in 1 second. And how you do that is, since every point in time and space is unique, there are not any 2 points that are identical, because then they'd be the same point. So if you have a target location and you know the frequency of that location, then you have a person or a vehicle or thing that you want to send there, you put the frequency of the target location around what you're sending, and there's an instant connection, because they cannot be in 2 places at the same time. So that's how vehicles can travel through deep space in a second, really. Now, in the beginning, we had a different technology for the time travel. Look, if you can imagine a mirror, it looked like a mirror with, you could see it, energy waves through it, and they would program the device to a specific point in history, frequency time, and you would literally step through the mirror. And when you got to the other, and it felt like you were passing through liquid, like a thicker liquid for a moment. And then when you pass through, you'd be on where you're supposed to be. And they were able to see you because you would be wearing an anchor device that would connect to the Montauk location. So they had a visual and an audio connection to the person that as they sent them. And they went through many different places. There was one group of aliens that actually had, for lack of a better term, a video. It's not really a video, it's more like a crystal that when you put it in the device, it showed you what was going on in historical times. So they were able to see Roman times and prehistoric times, anything. Everything on this planet has been recorded, everything. And they have libraries of this information that hopefully one day will be revealed to the public.
So is this like the chronovisor that some people have talked about? There's one gentleman, Andy Bashiago from Washington State, who says that he was involved in a program as a child. He talked about it as Project Pegasus, and that there was a chronovisor involved. And that kind of sounds very similar to what you described, a technology that you could look at the remote past or even the future.
I have heard of what he said. I wasn't involved in that particular experiment, but I believe it was an outgrowth of the Montauk Project. And quite frankly, when you travel through time, it has an effect on your body. Your physical body is not designed to do that. And after a bit of time, illnesses develop. For example, myself personally, For 29 years, I was physically blind. I couldn't see physical, I could only see energy. They had closed off, whether they did it purposely or accidentally, I'll never know. But they closed off the part of my brain that can physically see reality, and only a part of my brain that perceived the energy. So I could still go outside, I could still do things. I couldn't see physically, but I knew what was there. I had a very difficult time driving, I might add, especially when it was raining or snowing, because that has energy, and that would be constantly, it was impossible for me to go anywhere in that condition. But that is how I learned to do scanning people's bodies, scanning their health, because I could see the energy of the physical person. In 1999, I had a surgery to reconnect the optic nerves to my brain, and it was somewhat successful. Vision, but I can see physically. But now it's an overlay. So if you have an overhead projector where you put different layers of information and then it builds, that's how I see. I see the energy, then I see the physical, and so on. So it's a very difficult existence because you can't turn it off ever. And that's why it's difficult to sleep. Ever since Montauk Project, I really can't sleep very well. It upset my digestive system, my eyesight, my hearing is not so good, and so on. It damages the nervous system of the body when you constantly do this.
So how did you get involved in the Montauk Project? It sounds like in 1970, this is when that 29-year period began for you. So were you like there from the inception, and how come you were involved in that?
That's a very big question, Michael. And then I have to tell you my family background. And that is my great uncle, Stewart Swerdlow, was the first president of the Soviet Union. And, you know, it's a sordid history. My great-grandfather, Mikhail Sverdlov, had 9 children, and he groomed them to create what became Soviet Union. And he is the one that printed the documents of the Red Army back in 1917. And actually, Yakov, my great uncle, ordered the assassination of the Tsar in Yekaterinburg. Yekaterinburg was then renamed Sverdlovsk after my family. And so he became very important in Soviet Union. He sent my grandfather, his brother, to Britain to create the Communist Party there. And when my grandfather was successful in Britain, then he was sent to the United States to start the Communist Party in this country. My grandmother, Maya Sverdlov, was a Soviet spy during World War II. And it's quite interesting to me now what's going on in Ukraine, because my grandmother was working for the communists against the Nazis. And we kind of see the same thing happening again, incredibly, in 2022. So because of that background, my family in the United States was extremely monitored and observed. My father was taken under a mountain near El Paso, Texas, where he was interrogated for his loyalties and then made to work on different bases in the United States and Texas until I was born. When I was born, we were followed by Secret Service for many, many years. And loyalty was always questioned, especially it was Cold War time. And for that reason, and to ensure that my family in this country remained loyal to the American government, I was used in the experiment in 1970 and onward for that reason. And there were many other people under those circumstances as well. For decades, our mail was opened, phone taps, house bug still is actually. But that's how it was, and that became a normal way of life. And it goes even before that, and this is a very sensitive issue. When I was a very small child, my mother took me to a huge Victorian mansion for examination every week. Make a very long story short, I came to know this, his name was Dr. Green, and I knew that later on this was Mengele, that I was brought to for experimental purposes. My birth was unique. It's in medical books, so my mother told me. When she became pregnant, when she became into labor with me, her doctor sent her to a hospital that was not opened yet. It was under construction. And there was a compartment within that hospital where the doctors examined her, and they said it was impossible for her to have become pregnant because she had no birth canal. It was not possible. And so they had to do surgery on her to create a birth canal so that I could be born. And they said this had never been done before. And incredibly, at that moment was a doctor who happened to be an expert in this condition, who know that even though no one ever heard of it before, and he had been there and did the surgery on her. And I was monitored ever since then. So in retrospect, as an adult, as I think about my life, I now conceive the sequences of how I went from one thing to another. Whereas a child, I was just traumatized, you understand? And I had many, many traumas in childhood through brutal examinations and so on.
So when did you actually begin to be used in the Montauk Project? What were the first memories you have of you being involved in there, whether it was the time travel, whether it was vortex, or whatever other psychic paranormal research they were doing?
At night, in my room, every night, almost every night, I would get up in the middle of the night, and I didn't know why. And I had a sliding door closet in my bedroom. And when I opened the closet, there was a light. And when I stepped into the light, I was in Montauk. Of course, I didn't know it was Montauk at that time, but it was like a wormhole that was created from my bedroom to the Montauk Project. And then I'd be brought back before the morning. Sometimes I was there for days or weeks and then brought back to, let's say, 5 minutes after I left in the first place. So it looked like no time had passed. This happened quite a bit. And I had this feeling my parents knew what was going on because of the medical procedures or examinations I experienced as a child. And when I married my current wife, and I told her these stories, she said, well, you should ask your mother why she did that, you know, and I said to my mother constantly, I said, why did you take me to a dentist every week that would drill my teeth and do things without anesthesia? Why did you take me to this Dr. Green who would brutally examine me in a sexual manner, by the way, to the point where I'd be screaming and you weren't in the room? And she denied it and denied and denied it until finally, as an adult, when I moved to a different state, I had my teeth examined and the dentist said, who did this to you? This is completely unnecessary work. So I went back to my mother and I said, look, this is what the dentist said, I approve. And then my mother said, well, it wasn't every Friday. Finally, an admission. Now she's passed away since then. My father won't discuss anything because of the terrible communistic background of his family. And so over the years, I had to find the true information on my own. And I met many people who confirmed from the government and military. So, and I have a lot of anomalies in my body.
The sound has just gone. Could you repeat that? The sound just went.
From what point?
I'm sorry, yeah, when you were just the last 30 seconds.
So I was talking about the brutal examinations that I had gone through as a child that my mother finally confirmed. My father still to this day, he's not in his mind anymore, but he never would talk about it. And I had to find out on my own through the years, meeting with military people, intelligence agencies and so on that used to contact me, and I never knew why until I finally found out the truth about all of that. Mm-hmm. And so one thing that happened that was quite interesting as a child, I would wake up in my bed and there was a window straight ahead and it was on the second floor. And I would see this face, blonde-haired man, white complexion, looking at me and smiling, and it would always terrify me. Many years later, I saw it's Duncan Cameron, and I spoke to him, and he said it was my training to project to your house, to observe you, to trigger you, and so on. And mind you, Duncan was a very kind and wonderful person. He was my oldest friend. And in those days, we were under, I will say control, but threat if we didn't do what we were told. So I never blamed him for anything. And we became very good friends until he passed away a couple of years ago.
So exactly how old were you when you began being used in the Montauk Project? And do you remember any kind of trips or time travel experiments that you were involved in?
Yes, I began when I was 13 and a half years old. And it lasted until I was approximately 26, 27, I can't remember exactly. It was August 12th, 1983 when it crashed. So I was maybe 26 and a half at that time. I was sent physically, actually, to the Middle East, to Europe, Caribbean. These are physical trips that I went on to monitor activities, UFO activities, mind control activities in those locations, for example. But there were also times when I was sent through the time portal to different locations. For example, and this is the part that many people kind of get flabbergasted about, is that I was sent back to the time of Christ. And I was sent back with a gun. And I was told to shoot him. And I remember walking to the base of this huge building with stone steps going all the way up. And there at the top of the platform, I don't know what you would call it, was the Christ person. And he looked at me and I looked at him. And it's like, I knew he knew why I was there, and I ran away. And I was brought back, and I was severely punished for not accomplishing that mission. Then, about a year after that, I was sent back to the time when he was on the cross. And I was given a medical kit, and I was told to extract blood from his toe while he was on the cross. And I did that. And I brought it back. After that, they sent me to the underground of Mars, where I was supposed to give the vial to the person who was there, because they were creating a clone of Christ that was going to be used as the second coming at an appropriate time in the future. So that's what I tell people. If you see, they say Christ coming back, don't believe that, because this is the clone. At least that was the plan back then. And we won't, I think when the real one comes back, we will know. But this first one that comes back is not the real one.
So can you explain that? How would that work? I mean, as far as I know, when a clone is created, it doesn't have consciousness. There needs to be a consciousness or a soul put into that clone for it to be able to operate. So if they do have a cloned body of Jesus the Christ, without a consciousness or a soul inhabiting that, would it be kind of more or less useless, or could they still use it in some way?
That is a question many people have stated to me, but I will tell you categorically, no living creature is devoid of a soul. It has a soul. Whose soul is it? They have a technology, and I remember very clearly that they can capture the soul personality of a person when they die, and they keep them in a containment field, and they can use them as necessary. They can embed that soul into a cloned body or so on, or even into an android body, an AI. They can do all of these things. That technology came from the little grays. I don't like the term, but that's what they call them, because they're basically like puppets. They are completely cloned. They're basically fetuses grown to larger size, and then souls are embedded in them. And they even have a hierarchy where there are certain grays that are higher level than other grays, and they use like a little doll thing to manipulate them. And so the government learned certain things from that group, which, by the way, is not much around anymore. They were created by the reptilians as slave race. They're not a natural race. And by the way, neither are human beings natural race. We are an artificial race that technically should not exist.
So with the number of ET groups that were involved with the Montauk Project, I mean, did you ever see some of those extraterrestrials at the Montauk facility, whether they're reptilians, greys, or Syrians?
Absolutely, and I'll say all of the above. They were all there. There were beings also from Tau Ceti, Rigel. There were beings from Andromeda Galaxy. There were these hideous, I will call them mantis type creatures, insectoid creatures, which was very disturbing to me. And there were so many different beings. There were approximately 90 some odd different species that the government was interacting with, and that has grown. Now, 2022, actually in the last, let's say 20 years, that's been reduced to just maybe 5 or 6 different groups that they interact with. The others have been, let's say, expelled by the reptilians because they don't want them interfering here.
So with the reptilians in particular, what was it about the Montauk Project that they were interested in? Were they, I know you mentioned 300,000 children and adults. Were they interested in the genetics and how genetics could be used for these kind of time travel portal experiments? Or what else was it that the reptilians in particular were interested in?
The reptilian race, and by the way, there's more than one type of reptilian race. These were from the Draco Empire. They have an agenda to fan out through creation and assimilate and to occupy all. For them, that is their, lack of a better term, holy mission of their existence. They believe they are the superior race and that all others are inferior, and they need to either control them or change them. The reptilians, this particular race, are androgynous, meaning male and female in the same body. And that's why, Michael, we are seeing an agenda to create androgynous people on this planet, where boys are told they're girls and girls are told they're boys, and you want to be a giraffe, you could be a giraffe. I mean, you could just, there's no identity anymore. When you remove the identity of a person, then you can control them because they don't know who they are. So you tell them who they are and you tell them what they can do. And that's what unfortunately is happening on our planet. It's for manipulation and control.
Mm-hmm. Now, you mentioned actually having being taken or going to Mars. So what do you remember about Mars? What was the facility like there? And did you actually get to spend time on the surface of Mars?
Yes, and actually, there's an atmosphere. It's not like what they've told you. There's plants growing, there are animals there. It's not as like the Earth, no. The atmosphere is much thinner, but it's there. So imagine like if you went to a very high mountain here on Earth and you had a little trouble breathing, it's like that. So many of the, well, not many, all of the facilities are either under the ground with artificial atmosphere or they're in a dome type surface area also with atmosphere. But there's life on Mars. You know, when I hear about people like Elon Musk and so on, they say, oh, we're going to colonize Mars. I'm like, well, you're a little bit late for that one. It's been that way a long time. And you know that the Germans in 1937 had a mission to Mars. The Germans had technology that nobody knows about. And so that is like an alternate civilization that exists on our planet that is connected to our government, actually. What we have now is a battle between what people call left and the right, but it's really a battle between the spiritual side and the non-spiritual side. And I know that sounds religious, but that's what's happening.
Right. Well, with Mars and the atmosphere on Mars, I know on Earth, I mean, what is it? We have about like 78% nitrogen, about 20% oxygen, and then carbon dioxide. We have trace elements of that. But on Mars, NASA says that it's 95% carbon dioxide, which if you breathe that in on Mars, I mean, theoretically, you would just collapse or you would die. So if you're able to breathe on the surface of Mars, and it's just like being at an altitude of 12,000 feet or so, well, that's telling us that what NASA is telling us is a massive lie, that Mars doesn't have that great amount of carbon dioxide.
Absolutely correct. Not only that, but Venus is not as hot as they told you it was. I believe they told you the surface is 800, 900 degrees Fahrenheit, when in fact it's not. It's very livable. And in fact, before the end of the Soviet Union, the Soviets sent a vehicle to Venus with a camera that was able to penetrate or send pictures through the cloud cover back to Earth. And they took pictures on the surface that were never exposed or revealed to the people, because then the Soviet Union collapsed shortly thereafter. But in the last, say, 8, 9, 10 years, the Russian scientific groups have re-examined these pictures, and they have found 7 domed areas on the surface of Venus. And they said they found 3 living creatures on the surface. One looked like a reptilian or a dinosaur, one looked like a giant spider, and the other looked like a scorpion. And they said, how do you know it wasn't a rock formation? This is because it moved. You can see in the sequences of the photos, they have moved position and moved their bodies. They were living. That information has been dropped from the news. You cannot, maybe you can find it on the internet, I don't know. But I know that this existed, and maybe somebody can find it.
Mm-hmm. So as far as the Nazi German presence on Mars, I mean, you mentioned that they had craft going there during or even before the Second World War. How did you learn about that? Was that something that you learned while you're on the Montauk Project, or was it something you learned after the fact?
We learned this at Montauk because there were Nazi scientists in Montauk. They were the ones actually running the program, so to speak. We were told, we were indoctrinated, that if human beings were left to their own devices, they would kill them. They would annihilate the human race, because we were told humans are aggressive, violent, destructive, and so on. And so that it was, what we were doing was benefiting mankind to survive into the future. And that was the German mindset of what we were doing. And that's why we have such control on the planet, because they don't believe humans can or should develop their own systems, that they're dangerous. And in fact, the alien beings that exist, I would say a huge percentage of them consider humans to be very dangerous, and that this planet is like a very bad neighborhood, that everybody should stay away from it. Sometimes I think they're right, but there are other beings, for example, the insectoid beings, they want to annihilate humans. They think humans are a pestilence that should be eliminated from existence. There's many, many different perspectives out there, but this Earth, if I can put in perspective to most of the alien civilizations, we are like Syria. We're like the Syria of the galaxy. You know, very bad, dangerous place.
Mm-hmm. So another place that the Nazis supposedly set up bases was Antarctica. So while you were at the Montauk Project, was there any information about Antarctica and the Nazis there and the Nazis at Montauk?
Yes, because many of the children were sent there. The ones that, and mostly for, I don't like to say about sexual purposes and slavery and so on. That Neuschwabenland in Antarctica was developed from 1938 to 1944 as the paradise of the Führer, they called it. And there was New Berlin and New München and New Frankfurt, all these underground areas, but they were in caverns, natural caverns that were discovered, and actually the reptilians were there and they were given to them. But we also knew that in ancient times, very ancient times, Antarctica was not covered in ice, and actually was quite tropical and had plant life and animal life and so on. And it was only when the Earth had flipped in its axis that became frozen like that. And that happened approximately 10,500 BC, that happened. But the Syrians, in conjunction with the reptilians, created a technology to prevent that from ever happening again. In the 1960s, I believe 63, 64, NASA discovered a black colored satellite hovering far up above the North Pole. And they called it the Dark Night. That was like a term they used for the Dark Night. In 1965, they discovered underneath Baffin Island and Ellesmere Island in the northern part of Canada, approximately 100 kilometers under the ground, huge cylinders that had been put there, obviously not by human beings. These cylinders were connected energetically to this Dark Night satellite in the North Pole. So in effect, this satellite, it's kind of like a puppeteer holding the puppet. It's preventing the Earth from going sideways, so it will never shift again. It's like an anchor, if you will. That's what the Dark Night is for. Interesting.
So these cylinders that are connected to the Dark Night or the Black Night, I've heard that term used as well. They must be big. I mean, if they are anchoring the Earth in some way, they must be massive cylinders.
They are approximately 60 kilometers wide and 100 kilometers long. Very big.
And so they are anchored into the Earth's crust, and somehow this stabilizes it to prevent a future Earth change or pole shift.
Correct. That's correct. And you will notice if you study this, we have the electromagnetic poles, yes, that sometimes shift from side to side. And so you will notice that when the electromagnetic pole starts to shift or slide, it stops and then it starts to go back again. So it's kind of just hovering back and forth like this, anchored to this satellite.
Another place that the Germans apparently set up a base was on the far side of the moon. People
Yes.
called it Lunar Operations Command. Do you know anything about that?
Yes, we're not allowed to go there. The base itself, it was photographed, and it's in the shape of a swastika. And it's in a crater dome. And it was very interesting because when NASA first photographed this with one of the craft that they had sent to the dark side of the moon, and it was revealed, the pictures were intercepted by some other countries on the Earth, and they showed this the swastika-shaped building, and NASA said that they apologized for the offensive image, but it was from a glitch in the camera, and it wasn't actually that. You understand? Mm-hmm. Just to cover up. And quite frankly, a lot of the pictures, if not all, from the moon and Mars have been doctored up to look like rock and dirt, when in fact there are buildings and vehicles there. And that we know that NASA has done that.
Mm-hmm. So in 1972 was the last Apollo mission, the last manned mission to the moon. Some people say that we were warned off, NASA was warned off. So do you know anything about that?
Yes, that was part of what we learned in Montauk Project, because instead of sending a vehicle, we would send the person through a wormhole. And in fact, in Australia, in Pine Gap, I believe is the name of it, in Central Australia, it's an American base. It's not, no Australians even allowed there. And they have a wormhole from there to underground Mars. You can go directly from Australia to Mars in a matter of seconds. And so that has been established for many decades as well. I remember when I was working in the outback of Victoria, so far outside of Melbourne, my friend said to me, come outside, I want to show you something. We're in the middle of nowhere. And I looked up in the sky, and it was like a UFO highway, all heading towards Central Australia. And he says, watch this. He says, look at them and think about it one moment. And I looked at that, and it stopped. And I was like, it's listening to my mind. It recognized that I'm looking at it, and it stopped. And then it continued. It was the most incredible experience. And Michael, then we went to a restaurant one night after I was working in Melbourne, and we went to a restaurant on the way back towards Bendigo. And it was very late, and we were the last people in the restaurant, and they were putting the chairs up, but they said we could have coffee and so on. And so I was sitting on this side of the table, and my friends were sitting on the other side, and this man and woman walked in, and they sat on the other side of the restaurant and took the chairs down and sat. And my friend, who was very mentally or psychically sensitive, he says, they're looking at me. They're strange. They're looking at me. I feel them. And I'm like, what are you talking about? And I looked over to the table, and the man turned around and looked at me, and his eyes went black. I was like freaked out. And the woman looked and smiled. Her eyes went black. And then we left the restaurant.
I understand. So the connection between Montauk and the CERN project in Geneva is a very interesting one. So, you mentioned it briefly before, but we know that CERN has this huge particle accelerator, and people speculate, well, is this to create a kind of black hole, and that could somehow be manipulated to affect the Earth timeline? So what is CERN really about?
CERN is an interdimensional portal. We learned at Montauk that there are infinite realities. Every possibility that you can think of exist. And how did we learn this? Because they had attempted to send people back in time to change history. And they found out that you can't change history. Whatever is in this timeline, in the so-called past, must remain. If you alter an event, then it becomes another timeline, parallel to this, but not the same as this. And so they realized that in every possibility of existence, you can find something. So for example, the Hadron Collider in CERN, they know that there are realities where the Nazis maintain control. There are realities where Atlantis never was destroyed. There are realities where humans never existed, and so on and so on. So what Hadron Collider is doing is identifying alternate realities that enhance and improve the position of the deep state. And what they are attempting to do is collapse those realities into this one, blend, merge the reality where they have maintained their power. That's the idea of Hadron Collider, and that's why it's been sabotaged several times by certain groups who are against that agenda. Outside our solar system, or surrounding it, is a region called Kuiper Belt. And after that is the Oort Belt, before you go into deep space. You may recall several years ago, they reclassified the planet Pluto because they said, oh, it's not a planet, it's an object in the Kuiper Belt. Well, actually, so is Neptune, and so is part of Uranus, but they didn't reclassify them because Pluto is actually not a natural object. It is an artificial observation post that came into our solar system in 1930. And it's not from here. By the way, neither is our moon. Our moon is artificial as well. And so there are beings in the Kuiper Belt, literally surrounding our solar system as a containment, because as I mentioned earlier, we are considered a very dangerous species that must be contained or eliminated. So there's going to be an actual, I should say, invasion. I don't know if that's the right word because we already invaded, but a different kind of invasion by those who are going to want to change what's going on here. I will add that those who are in power on our planet now, both in this government and others, have an agenda that they want to complete in the next 2 years. And that agenda is not so pleasant for humanity, but it's one that might prevent World War III and IV and so on. And so my feeling is in the Kuiper Belt, there are insectoids, there are humanoids, there are etheric beings, everything you can imagine. It's like a United Nations of species who are saying, okay, what do we do with this place? We can't leave them like this, but we can't leave either. They consider that their worlds are in danger from us. Because as you know, there are fleets that have been developed in the past by the Nazis and so on that are a danger to those out there in the universe. And so they need to do something about this. And unfortunately, the next 2 years will be very stressful, disturbing, and so on, until things are put back into a condition where we can move forward.
Well, I remember there was a series that Amazon aired called Man in the High Castle, where it was based on a short story by Philip Dick, the sci-fi writer, and it talked about this scenario where you actually had a reality where the Nazis won the Second World War, and the series showed also the parallel reality where the Allies won the Second World War, and it was like there were temporal agents from that Nazi reality trying to influence our reality to be more like it. So it sounds like that story, that series, Man in the High Castle, is a kind of soft disclosure, trying to introduce people. But it sounds like from what you're saying that this is happening right now, and and that kind of like raises the question: well, this whole World Economic Forum, Klaus Schwab, that kind of Nazi-esque quality that he radiates. It's like, well, it sounds like this is exactly what is happening, and the World Economic Forum is like a Nazi front for kind of like geoengineering Earth so that we can move into this parallel reality where the Nazis won.
My opinion is they did win. They just changed the venue of their location, their central location. But, since the late 1940s, they've been in control of American government and even European governments. And so, in 1946, 47, there was Project High Jump, where the Americans sent a fleet to Antarctica and was pretty much destroyed by the Nazis there. After that, in 1952, you remember there were these overflights over Washington, D.C. of these vehicles that they said were swamp gas, it was an atmospheric anomaly and so on. But these were Fourth Reich vehicles. And they basically, we're flying over your capital and you cannot stop us. We won. You understand? And that's when agreements were made, and they were brought into the military, they were brought into the aeronautical corporations and so on and so on. And that's what we have now. We have basically the Western world run by the Fourth Reich. And this was acknowledged to me by someone very high up in the government.
That's that is always kind of a shock to hear. I mean, others have said similar things, but it's always refreshing to hear it from a completely new perspective, that you got this information during your time at the Montauk Project in the 1970s. And
even recently, Michael, and I can't go too much detail, but there's someone that I deal with very high up, and he says to me, well, Stewart, there is the Fourth Reich and they are here. And he just told me these things. And I'm like, yes, I know, I put them in my books. I know about them. And unfortunately, people won't believe it. But with what's going on now, they are going to believe it.
Yeah, it does seem that we're going through an unprecedented global awakening with all of these efforts to remove civil liberties and to really shift power away from the United States. The agenda seems to be to collapse the United States as a functional nation state and make everything move everything over to China, the communist China, to make it the new global hegemon.
That's correct. And I was also told that the future government will be a blend of Nazism and communism.
Well, that takes me to this question about these 20-year cycles. I interviewed Peter Moon a few weeks ago, and he said that the 20-year cycle is a natural biorhythm of the Earth. And in the Montauk Project, it was 1943. I guess something happened in '63, but then there was '83, 2003, and next year, of course, is 2023. So, what does that mean for next year? I mean, how important is that in terms of this Earth's natural biorhythm of 20 years when these portals seem to open up or reconnect?
I'm going to tell you, I was told just recently that the big change will be 2024. Now, that doesn't mean that it doesn't initiate the year before, but in 2024, everybody will know who is in charge on this planet. And I was told not everybody's going to like it, and there's going to be casualties. I was also told, you want to know what it's going to be like? Look at Ukraine right now. That is the precursor for the rest of the world as far as the synthesis of different powers, and the result there will be extrapolated globally. Interesting.
So are you optimistic or pessimistic about our future? Are we going to implode as a global civilization, or are we going to enter a golden age?
Michael, that's a very difficult question. I believe it or not, despite everything, I do consider myself to be a very spiritual person. And I believe despite the agendas of those who think they're in control, God has his own agenda. And ultimately, that is what will win. And that's what I am looking forward to.
So it really is unpredictable. No one really knows what's going on, because I know there's a lot of people putting out narratives out there, whether it's positive or whether it's negative. But at the end of the day, you say it really can be a wild card up until the very end, and we're not going to know. And 2024 seems to be the end date.
Yes. Well, let's say not the end date. Let's say it's the beginning of some new system. Mm-hmm. And I was told that might last 30 or 40 years. But again, to translate something, they say, man supposes and God disposes. So no matter what these people's agenda can be, it doesn't mean it has to be that way. There's other factors that people don't. If they would bring up the spiritual energy within them, all of this can change. It could change. And that's one of the realities that exist. We can do that.
So what about the extraterrestrial factor? How do you think that's going to play out? I mean, is there going to be a big announcement soon? Is there going to be a false flag alien invasion event? Are the aliens going to just appear and awaken humanity? What do you think is going to happen?
So I asked about that to this person who knows it. I said, when are they going to announce the truth? He said, not for another 10 years. Until then, it will be cover stories. And really, it's because the aliens themselves don't want to be revealed. They don't want humans to really know about them yet, because we're dangerous. And humans have technology now that rivals the alien technology. So we have become quite a liability to them.
Mm-hmm. Okay, all right. So if people want to find out more about your work, get your books, what do they do?
Expansions.com is my website. We're also on Facebook and Vimeo. I do a podcast every week about the news, and I tell people what the news is really about. I send that to you. Also, you can distribute as you wish, but expansions.com, and we have our books, our videos, our blogs. We have webinar every Wednesday evening. It's a one-stop shop for everything that you want to know about.
Well, I want to thank you, Stewart, for coming on the show and sharing your tremendous knowledge and experience and memories about the Montauk Project and what that means for us today.
Thank you, Michael. I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you so much.
You have been listening to Exopolitics Today with Dr. Michael Salla. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe to this channel. Join or start a conversation in the comments. Take the time to explore the vast library of best-selling books, webinars, and podcasts by Dr. Salla. Visit exopoliticstoday.com.